Being an author of Star Wars novels in the 90s could not have been easy. The nice thing was they had a full cast of characters to play with. Luke, Han, Leia, Lando, and the gang got into all sorts of misadventures, had children. It was a grand old time. However, there were also very, very specific things they couldn't talk about. What am I referring to? Well, it should be obvious. The Star Wars original trilogy was the second half of George Lucas's vision. While many characters and stories start in the original trilogy, a ton of the universe's history comes from what we now know as the prequels and earlier. I mean, in episode 4, we hear reference to Obi-Wan, Anakin, and the Clone Wars. What were the Clone Wars? Well, I covered that in the past, but before the prequels, George Lucas didn't know, and Star Wars authors certainly did not. That's why, for example, in the Thrawn trilogy, we hear discussion of clone masters with the implication that the Clone Wars was an attack by cloners on the rest of the galaxy. For more information, I've done an entire video on alternate views of the Clone Wars before the prequels. But it's a lot more than just that conflict. We didn't know what the Jedi were like, who the Sith were, how Palpatine rose to power, the exact details of Anakin's fall. All of that, you gotta put yourself in the position of someone who had only seen the original trilogy, was still a mystery. And it's a mystery Star Wars authors were more often than not told to keep away from. The references to the Clone Wars in books like the Thrawn trilogy are rare exceptions, but otherwise, novels really had to play a tough game of alluding to the past without fully exploring it. This, of course, changed as the Star Wars prequels were releasing. In the expanded universe novels taking place in the future, we have characters like Luke Skywalker in the Dark Nest Crisis, learning more about the past through, in that specific case, hidden memories on R2-D2, where he's essentially watching Revenge of the Sith scene by scene. A somewhat interesting, especially in retrospect, version of this conundrum comes in before the storm. In the novel, and the Black Fleet Crisis as a whole, Luke sets off on a journey to learn more about his mother, who he's told was a member of the Fallen Nasi, a sort of Jedi-adjacent Force sect. Reading this after the prequels, we know that the book is either going to pull a fast one on us, or that somewhere along the line they had to perform a major retcon. It ends up being, of course, the former, but in 1996, that would have been a compelling story. I also have always loved this depiction of Anakin and Padme, initially designed for a 1993 Topps Star Wars card game, where we see a very different, but honestly more honest to the OT's story version of Anakin standing menacingly near his wife Padme and one of the children. Because remember, after the original trilogy, we knew very, very little about the Skywalker matriarch, other than that she apparently spent some time with Leia, which of course didn't really end up being true. And I want to get to Darth Vader in particular because he's kind of my main focus for this video, but you have to think about the Jedi as a whole. Yes, we get some very basics of the Jedi Order in episode 5 especially, but before the prequels, what the Jedi are were a complete mystery, and that is arguably the space Legends explores most when talking about the prequel era, because of course Luke Skywalker is looking to rebuild the Jedi Order. People had many different interpretations of what the Jedi would be like. Some certainly believed they'd be more sort of noble, singular warriors. Through novels like the Jedi Academy trilogy and I, Jedi in particular, we see a lot of what Kevin J. Anderson and his contemporaries thought, where the Jedi were sort of integrated in regular society, although obviously following the Order. There were Corellian Jedi traditions. Jedi took families and had Jedi children. This was all very common. Really, not only common, it feels like it's encouraged or by design. One of my favorite bits of weird-ish lore from Jedi of that era has to be the Chunthor. It's this very strange Jedi Academy ship which used to travel around the galaxy training students. Pretty cool idea. Anyway, moving on to Darth Vader, I thought about this video because I'm currently rereading for the first time in I don't know how long, maybe 2 decades, the Shadows of the Empire novel. And this is a book I shouldn't have been reading as a kid. It's really horny. Prince Shizor is always talking about asses and what he wants to do to the various women, but that's aside from today's video. For those who have played the game, the Shadows of the Empire novel is completely different. Dash Rendar as a character does exist. He's sort of a side character, however. The novel is more focused on what's going on with Shizor, Vader, Luke, Leia, and the other main heroes. However, what really struck me as unique is that we get scenes written from the perspective of Darth Vader, where we get serious insight into what he's feeling, what he desires, the pain of his suit, what he wants for the future, and interestingly, a little bit of his past. And you've actually got to give credit to Steve Perry, who wrote the novel. He didn't know anything about what Darth Vader would eventually do to Padme or the children in the prequels, but he captures the sense of regret and anger and frustration that always seems to be permeating Darth Vader in modern writings about the character extremely well. It's remarkable how good of a job he does knowing almost nothing about the character's backstory, which got me thinking some of you might be interested in what exactly we knew about Darth Vader before the prequels, because, I mean, you watch A New Hope, you're not even sure he's a man. Obviously, the other two films clear that up, but I very much knew what would happen to Darth Vader before the prequel films made their way to theaters. How was that? Well, George actually did a bit of work establishing what happened. I mean, we know from A New Hope that Anakin Skywalker betrayed and murdered, well, some people, but the novelization for A New Hope, which actually released in 1976, paints a fairly accurate image of what happened to the Republic, albeit with some modifications. Palpatine in the 1976 novelization was more of an emperor who was controlled by the Empire's bureaucrats into committing evil, while in the Return of the Jedi novel, we actually get more details about Vader himself, and I'll just read the quote. "You should not think of that machine as your father." It was the teacher speaking again. "When I saw what had become of him, I tried to dissuade him, to draw him back from the dark side. We fought. Your father fell into a molten pit. When your father clawed his way out of that fiery pool, the change had been burned into him forever. He was Darth Vader, without a trace of Anakin Skywalker, irredeemably dark, scarred, kept alive only by machinery and his own black will." I actually, by the way, really like the clawing his way out of the fiery pool, because I don't know if that was just an image that George Lucas had in his mind, but obviously it translated quite well into what we actually saw in Revenge of the Sith. George Lucas's backstory for Vader was actually known before this point. It was in original scripts for some of his earlier works. He's mentioned it in interviews. So arguably that most important aspect of Vader's character has been established really since the beginning. He was a powerful Jedi turned evil, cut down by Obi-Wan specifically, and burnt terribly in a volcano, which, like, that's the most George Lucas thing ever. Either way, I know this video was a little bit rambly and I touched on a lot of specific things. I'm going to be checking the comments on this one. Is there something specific you want me to dive into deeper, like I did in my Clone Wars video? This was meant to be just sort of a brief overview of a bunch of different topics. A lot of them could deserve more time. I really like looking at how things which were eventually explained in the prequels were portrayed beforehand. But that's all I've got. I'll see you guys next time. May the Force be with you.